Assalamu alaikum, and this is a special podcast coming to you from Cape Town, South Africa. This podcast is brought to you by IRCICA and OCAF South Africa. We're going to be discussing the topic of Islam in South Africa, and particularly in the Western Cape, and specifically Cape Town. Somebody with us today who is going to help us understand everything, and I'm Shafiq Morton, is Abdud-Daiyaan Petersen. He is chairperson of the Cape Family Research Forum. He's also the principal archival research advisor. He's also a research advisor to our Cape Town heritage, and he was also one of the researchers for the book on Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi. But Abdud-Daiyaan Petersen, assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Shukran for having me.
Right, we're tackling a big topic. We're talking about the history of Islam in the Western Cape, in Cape Town in particular. And if my memory serves me correctly, around about 1658, I think the first Muslims arrived in Cape Town. They didn't arrive as free citizens, they actually arrived as slaves. So what information have you got as far as that is concerned?
So the first information, or the earliest information that we have of possible Muslims coming to the Cape is an individual who was a stowaway from Batavia, a slave by the name of Abraham van Batavia. And he came in around, I think, 1856, 1858, one of those years, I can't remember.
I mean 1600.
Sorry, 1658, 200 years before. And he escaped slavery from Batavia, stowed away on the ship, landed at the Cape, and then re-enslaved at the Cape. And judging by his name and, his place of origin, Batavia, and his name being Abraham, it's quite likely that he was, in fact, the very first Muslim at the Cape.
All those years ago. And I believe that after that, Jan van Riebeck, from the Dutch East India Company, who was sent to the Cape in 1652, started making a call for slaves. And apparently the first slaves, I believe, came from Africa, and a lot of them also came from the Far East, and of course, many of them were Muslims.
Yeah, so many of these slaves were Muslims and came from Muslim spaces. Many slaves came from West Africa. We know about, the Wolof people, Usman Danfodio of Nigeria, and the strong Muslim presence and Muslim scholarship that has existed in that part of the world for hundreds of years. Also, the East African coast, from, let's say, Ethiopia, all the way down to the southern part of Mozambique, where many Muslims, again, there were Muslims in Ethiopia, Muslims in Zanzibar, Muslims in Sofala, and all those regions which we, as a Cape society, just broadly termed Masbikers, which has formed, one of the sub-identities of our people here in South Africa. But also what's quite fascinating is that as there were Muslim merchants that came from India, particularly Surat, Korkan, Goa, etc., there were also slaves brought from those very places, such as slaves from Surat, like Dorothea van Surata, other slaves from the whole Malabar coast, and so on. And of course, your slaves from Indonesia, Ceylon, etc.
And of course, perhaps what makes, I think, the Cape quite different was that the IRCICA, and I believe 182 of them from around about 1658 until 1795, when the Dutch East India Company finally went bankrupt, was sent to the Cape. And my understanding is that the IRCICA were nobility. Tell us something more about this, because amongst these people were a lot of educators and sheikhs.
So the Orang Kaya, actually, which is a Malay word, Orang meaning people, and Kaya Kaya just means rich. There's a type of an egg custard spread that they've got in Singapore that they call Kaya jam, so which is quite rich. So you can think of gold riches, and other types of wealth. That's what it meant. Rich people, wealthy people perhaps rich in spirituality, rich in money, rich in status, etc. And so these Orang Kaya, I mean, they littered Southeast Asia with these little principalities, sultanates, kingdoms, and, subclasses of the Sultan, the advisors, the spiritual advisors, the Imam of the royal court, and so on. And so when the Dutch colonized that part of the world, or attempted in, destabilizing some of those regions, they would then pick on these sub-roles, such as the religious advisors and other advisors, because they knew that, yes, perhaps the king might be the figurehead, but it's really these people that advise him that they call the shots. They really control the power. And so if you want to destabilize this region, these are the people that you take out. And that's why there are so many of them. Obviously, there aren't that many sultans and kings, but for one sultan, there are how many advisors? And so, just take all of those people and scatter them, throughout the colonies. Take them to Ceylon, like Sheikh Yusuf, and bring them to Robben Island, bring them to the Rustenburg estate here in Cape Town. But take them away from places where they can still influence and fight against the Dutch colonization.
And I believe that some of the first Orang Kaya, as you say, that came to Cape Town were actually sent to the forests of Constantia, which was some distance from Cape Town, which underlines what you were saying, that these people were deliberately scattered throughout the world so they couldn't upset anybody. But it's interesting because there is a thesis that a lot of these people created communities wherever they were exiled to, and that they became like hubs, that the slaves would come to them for comfort, for education, and that by default these people started to spread Islam in the Cape Colony.
There was a term I heard once referring to the now they are kramats, of when they were still alive, of people of transoceanic memory, and them being brought here from Malacca. Let's take the people who we in Cape Town specifically refer to as the Orang Kayan, which are about 2 or 3 kramats, or mazars, darbars, dargahs, maqams, that we've got in Cape Town, 2 or 3 in the Constantia area of Cape Town. There is some information that they were brought on a ship called the Polsbroek in around 1668, roughly. And 2 were placed, as Uncle Shafiq mentioned, in the company's forest, and 1 was placed on Robben Island. And so when you think of these individuals as, crossing the ocean and having the memory and the experience of being in royal courts, advising, knowing how to control people, knowing how to influence people, when they are brought to these spaces like the company's forest, and when you've got slaves that have got to, chop down the trees for wood, for building the city, or assisting with the plantations in the region, they then come to these people, or come across these people who had power previously. And so you can only imagine the type of influence that these experienced people and spiritually wealthy people must have had on these slaves that surrounded them or came into contact with them, and then quite possibly and probably mobilized them into a very early, unstable Muslim community.
And of course, this early Muslim community was a very diverse one. You've already mentioned so many different influences from Africa, and historically research reveals that the Cape Town Muslim identity is 50% African, if you count Madagascar and other parts of the SADC region. And of course, the other percentage from all over the place. So it's an interesting mix, isn't it? But I think the other question that arises is, why was this community called Malay when a lot of the people in the community weren't Malay? Where does this come from?
Sure, it's a very tough question. It's a loaded question, especially for Cape Town as it is today, and local Cape Muslim academia. But I think let's go back around maybe 250 years. Let's go to the in fact, let's go even further. Let's go back to the 1600s with these early exiles. Many of these exiles were actually referred to as Makassaris. because many exiles having come from Makassar. So we can think that the Muslim community at that time in the late 1600s, were broadly Makassaris, Let's move a bit further forward. There's a lot of Muslims brought from Java. So you can think of the Muslims as Javanese. There's Muslims brought from Maduris, Muslims brought from Sumatra, Muslims brought from all these different Palembang, different places where these exiles came from. And so you can sort of see how there isn't one identity for all of them. And if you go to the documents from that period, very few actually refer to these exiles or these Muslims as Malay. I could probably count on my hand in each volume how many were referred to as Malay, whereas far more were referred to as Van Palembang. But today ask a Cape Townian what's Palembang, they think you're talking garbage. It's a made up word. And so as you move forward, there were Bugis Muslims in Stellenbosch in the 1760s. So then you think, oh, okay, so the Muslims were Buginese. There was, moving forward. And around the time of the Battle of Blouberg in 1806, the Imam who had to lead the Muslims in the battle, he was referred to as the Javaanse Veldpriester, a Javanese Veldpriester, a Javanese field priest. Yet his name was Frans van Bengal. He was supposedly an Indian slave. So how do you put all of this together where you've got Palembang and Bugis and Makassaris and Javanese and all these things together? You then have to look at the British and think of, where were the British, around the early 1800s? What were they doing? Where were they colonizing at the time? And I'm not going to give any answers, but, judging from that, you can so slowly start to see why the Muslims at the Cape become attributed as being Malay. Another issue is the fact that the language that was taught at the Cape to the Muslims by these exiles was a lingua franca that many could understand, which was the Malay language. So they were Malay literate at the time. Also, the flavor of Islam at the time that Tuan Guru was teaching was a very Malay type of Islam. And so you can see how the type of cultural Islam that was being taught at the Cape, that was being used to formulate a more stable Muslim community around the time of Tuan Guru, was a very Malay Islam. So using that as well as the fact of what the British was doing at the time together, we can start to see how, Malay gets, plastered over an entire very, very, very diverse community of Muslims in South Africa.
Let's quickly have a look at some of the main historical characters. You've got Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, Sayyid Yusuf of Makassar, who comes here in 1694 at the end of a long and illustrious life. He passes on in 1699 but leaves a huge legacy here. You have Tuan Guru or Imam Abdullah ibn Qadi Abdul Salam, who arrives here in 1780. Then you have Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi, who arrives here in 1862. And it does seem as if historically these three figures are pinned as being sort of axial characters in the identity of the Cape, and particularly Imam Abdullah, known as Tuan Guru, in terms of how he educated our local community. I mean, what do you make of this? I mean, it's an interesting historical continuum, isn't it?
Sure, it's interesting indeed. Although I feel that to set it up for Tuan Guru, we have to look at figures that were involved in the interim, where we've got, Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, that, globally people are aware of what he has done. We've got the book that yourself has written and, papers that others have written about Tuan Guru and the role that he played at the Cape. But what about the people in between? And I think a very important individual to make note of is someone by the name of Tuan Said Alawi. Just setting it up before we get to Tuan Guru. Tuan Said Alawi comes in around the 1744. He lands on Robben Island with his compatriot, his buddy, Haji Matarim, both of whom were advisors on the island of Madura, in the Sultanate of Matarim. And as we've discussed before, of what happens to the advisors, of course, they were brought, as exiles to the Cape. And Tuan Said Alawi then gets released from the island, but his friend Haji Matarim dies and gets buried on the island, where today his grave is actually a maqam, a kramat. But back to Tuan Said Alawi, once he is released, he is given a very humiliating role in Cape society, which is the role of a kafre, or a slave policeman, where effectively you, as being of the underclass, now have to police your very own people. You have to go and assist them in disciplining, your own people, your own Jama, perhaps, the people you live with, and so on, all the slaves and so on. And so he's given this humiliating role. But as a true Muslim, he finds solace in Allah, and he turns it around. And he actually uses this role to his advantage, where according to oral tradition, he walks into the slave lodge with a Quran under one arm and a pair of slippers under the other arm, and he gives the slippers to these slaves who were not allowed to wear slippers. And at the same time, he also teaches them the philosophies of Islam, the philosophies of freedom that we actually see later on after Tuan Guru's influence, like through statements of Imam Haji Muhyiddin Madin, where he states in 1825 in the Briggs interview, when asked about slaves and slavery in Islam, he says, we teach them that when they enter the mosque, that their bodies might be, chained and enslaved, but their souls are free. And they must look up to Allah to free them when they die. So here we can see how there is this continuum of, Sheikh Yusuf's very philosophical type of Islam, and slowly progressing to Tuan Said Alawi and the role that he played, and then moving to, or setting up for Tuan Guru to really consolidate a Muslim community and bring his teachings and formulate a madrasa system, which has been written about extensively in many publications. And then slowly after Tuan Guru, we see the results and the productive effects of what they have done.
Yeah, it's a story. We can carry on talking about it forever. Just very briefly, Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi, because we will be doing a separate podcast on him. He comes at a very interesting juncture, doesn't he? Because what happens after Tuan Guru passes on in 1807, there are no more exiles sent to the Cape. So now there are no more scholars that are coming, and knowledge starts to fray at the edges. It's the only way I can explain it. And people start to lose a sense of their being. They don't lose the iman. They know exactly who they are. But when it comes to issues of fiqh, they start to drown a little bit. And Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi arrives at the Cape, and he is, I think, the first teacher to come to the Cape as a free man, as a man of dignity. What do you make of that? This is somebody who had very high status in the Ottomans, and he comes to a place like Cape Town. It must have been really mind-boggling for him.
I think, as you mentioned, the timing in which he came, where Tuan Guru passes away in 1807, and Tuan Guru's children are quite young, and the other exiles also die in the early 1800s up until 1820 or so on. And the next group, which are the adults who had access to Tuan Guru, then start dying in the 1840s. And the children in the time of Tuan Guru, who were then taught by the adults that were learnt under Tuan Guru, start dying in the 1860s. And when an individual, the first Haji at the Cape, Karel Pilgrim, passes away in 1863, that is the same year that Abu Bakr Effendi comes. So he actually comes at the perfect time when things are slowly starting to die out at the Cape. And we actually see this through court cases where, there's some infighting happening, people, within Jama'as taking each other to court. And so perhaps Abu Bakr Effendi's situation did not help that as much because of, the climate at the Cape, very volatile across the board. But it appears that in terms of knowledge, he was, it seems, the first real bringer of knowledge to the Cape since probably those exiles, those original exiles that came here with knowledge in their heads, taught those adults, who taught those children, who were then dying out, and their knowledge slowly fizzling away by the time Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi comes.
Yeah, as I say, we will deal with him in a later podcast because his life is certainly very, very interesting. The other question is about the Cape Muslim identity, and this is something that I go on quite strongly about because I regard it as it's a unique creolized identity, and I do not use the word Creole here in the negative way at all because we are who we are. We can't help it. We don't ask to be born who we are. But the point is that it's a vibrant community. It's been around for nearly 400 years. So in terms of minorities, I think we're one of the longest established Muslim minorities in the world in the colonial framework. But what do you make of the Cape Muslim identity? It really is unique, isn't it?
Sure, I have to concur on that. It probably is one of the most unique Muslim identities around the world. And if you think of slavery around the world, other places where slavery was present and where creolization was rife, like Haiti, Brazil, broadly the Americas and so on. And you look at where other Muslim slaves were taken to, like America itself, where, as I've mentioned, those highly educated Muslim West Africans in the American archives are Qur'ans, documents, kitabs written by those educated West African Muslims. But what happened to Islam there? It died out, All that was left was the blues, which, replicated, the adhan and so on in the tones. But contrary, if you look at Cape Town, where all these people were brought here, Muslims, non-Muslims, Muslims were formed, people became Muslim, community was formed. Cape Town, I believe, is actually one of the only places where Islam has sustained from the first Muslim being brought here all the way till the present day, where for probably not one day in the history of Cape Town was Islam not being practiced at the Cape since the first Muslim set foot here.
And that certainly is a very interesting story indeed. Thanks to Abdud-Daiyaan Petersen for talking to us, chairperson of the Cape Family Research Forum in Cape Town, principal archival research advisor to our Cape Town heritage, and also one of the researchers team for the book on Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi. From myself, Shafiq Morton, on behalf of IRCICA and OCAF South Africa, Abdud-Daiyaan Petersen, shukran, thanks for talking to us.
And shukran for having me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.